Feed your head, engage your brain, and enter the mind's eye, your one-stop shop for politics to paranormal and everything in between. I'm your humble host, DJ BJ Turnov, and this is the Mind's Eye on Z Talk Radio. Holy frickin' jingle balls. It is December 14th, can you believe it? And this is crazy to say, but we're just a few days away from the next year of 2018. And with that comes some good news and some bad news, which by this point, if you've been listening for a while, you've already expecting. First, I'll give you the bad, since I like to get that out of the way always. This episode will unfortunately be the last of the year before our annual winter break, but at least let me give you some good news too, and I guess it's a bit of a re-gift of sorts. Aren't those the worst? That is, this episode as well is your good news too, because we're going to celebrate the life of one of the greatest singers in American popular music, and sadly, just a few days ago, we did mark the anniversary of his tragic death. None other than the King of Soul, Otis Redding, the man behind such classic hits as "These Arms of Mine," RESPECT, "I Got Dreams to Remember," "Sitting on the Dock of the Bay," Nah, and so many other classic covers that you probably thought were his because he owned those songs. And apologies to you and Otis for definitely not doing him any favors for covering his music. But, you know, for me personally, what separated Otis from so many of my other favorite artists is that voice. Like it was sent straight from the gut of God. And that voice has helped me through some hard times. We've cried together, and it's been in the background of some of my best life moments. Obviously, you feel the same way, and so many all-time classic artists felt the same way too. George Harrison, Janis Joplin, Lynyrd Skynyrd, Marvin Gaye, Al Green, Jay-Z. I mean, all these classic and contemporary artists name him as a huge influence. Redding's music has been the soundtrack of our lives, but what about Redding's life? I mean, for such an influential and seminal artist, surprisingly, there is a dearth of biographical work on the man. We're going to try and change at least that a little bit tonight. We're bringing in Ezra Wheeler, tour guide for the Memphis Rock and Soul Museum. Great little place if you haven't been there. He's going to fill in some of the gaps about Otis's life. We're going to talk about Redding's path from Georgia to becoming one of the best all-time singers. We're going to jam-pack this hour with stories about Otis. What was he like? I mean, how did his friends describe him? We'll briefly talk about some of his all-time performances at Whiskey A Go-Go and Monterey Pop Festival. And of course, you can't talk about Otis without talking about his music, which we're going to dedicate a large portion of the show to. We'll talk about the stories behind originals and covers alike. We've got some dreams and stories to remember about Otis Redding coming up next. This is The Mind's Eye on Z Talk Radio. Welcome back to The Mind's Eye on Z Talk Radio. Like we said before, George Harrison of the Beatles, I mean, who doesn't know that by now? I mean, he once referenced Otis Redding, the man which we're going to be talking about tonight, as a huge influence on one particular Beatles song, and that is Drive My Car, which I believe is off Rubber Soul. But even George, Paul, Ringo, and John, even they fall victim to crazy frauds. One such is the strange tale of the unauthorized albums of the Beatles' Christmas recordings. After the band broke up just before the 1970 holiday season, fan club members from the UK and US, for absolutely free, they received a special Beatles Christmas album sent to them from Apple Records. And thus began the strange tale of the Beatles' music being completely ripped off and exploited by a huge scam during the 80s that was really popular, where pretty much shelter record labels would exploit artists, their music demos, B-sides, things of that nature, and sell it to the unknowing public, obviously for huge amounts of profit without sharing any to the artist. The holiday season, doesn't that just bring out the best and worst in us? Go get a little more information about that strange little tale about the Beatles. Go to our social media pages. We got Twitter, @Mind's Eye Show. Same deal for Facebook.com/Mind's Eye Show. Pretty much just go to Mind's Eye Show to Twitter, Facebook, and we even got a little thing going on in Instagram. You can find out more information about that strange tale. And also our great guest tonight coming up next, Ezra Wheeler from the Memphis Rock and Soul Museum. We're going to be talking about Mr. Pitiful himself, King of Soul, more on the life, music, and death of Otis Redding. After a quick word from our sponsor, The Mind's Eye. We'll be right back. Ezra Wheeler of Memphis Rock and Soul Museum joins us now. We are going to sing a little duet, sing the praises of the King of Soul, Otis Redding. Ezra, I've been looking forward to this one for quite a while now. Thank you for a Mind's Eye moment. Truly appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here, and Otis has always been one of my favorites, so I'm happy to join and talk about him.
I really appreciate it, and obviously I feel the same way. That's what connects us today. And let's start with you, though, before we go and talk about Otis for the rest of the evening. You're a tour guide at the Memphis Rock and Soul Museum. I visited the museum back in 2014. I loved it. I mean, they really got some great stuff on display. What can visitors expect when they visit the museum today?
A little bit about us. We were founded by the Smithsonian Institute. They actually developed what became our museum. It was supposed to be a traveling exhibit about the history of American music, and as they did their research, they kind of found out all roads led back to Memphis. So what was initially planned as, like I said, a traveling exhibit, it became a permanent museum here. And essentially we start in the era around the 20s and 30s. We do starts with, sharecropping, guild holler music. And then we move on to the era of Beale Street and blues and jazz, on the Sun Studios with the birth of rock and roll and rockabilly. And then we kind of end our exhibit around 60s and 70s with Stax, which of course was the home of Otis Redding, and High Records, which home of people like Ann Peebles and Al Green. So we really try to run the gambit, of good 40 or 50 years of Memphis music, which is also largely the story of American music.
What's your favorite part of the museum? I mean, as a tour guide, you have to say everything, but what do you love talking about the most?
Just for me personally, my favorite era of Memphis music is certainly that latter part I was talking about, the soul music of Stax and High. We also have some great memorabilia from that era. A lot of cool stuff from Isaac Hayes, great suits and stuff from Al Green. So that to me is kind of the most personally resonant. And of course Otis as well. But and also I think another part of the story that I enjoy talking about is kind of that area in the 1950s and just the important role that Memphis played in terms of radio, which I think is a story a lot of people don't know. First black radio station, WDIA, was started here. First all-female radio station, WHER, was started here. So I think and the people like Rufus Thomas, B.B. King were DJs. So I think that's part of the Memphis music story that maybe a lot of people don't know, and so that's always, a fun thing to inform people about.
How about the music in Memphis today? It's still alive and kicking, right?
Absolutely. I think we definitely hit a downtime, but it really feels like we're having a resurgence. There's some really interesting stuff going on, but a lot of it does touch back on the roots. Bands like Southern Avenue, I think, are a really great representation of the new kind of Southern soul sound. Then you also have things like Goner Records, which is big in kind of the punk and garage rock. And so there's really a big diversity of music, but still a great live music scene, still a lot of interesting, cool stuff coming out. So, yeah, I think that legacy definitely lives on.
And since we are talking about Otis Redding, how does the museum feature the artist?
Well, I think Otis, he's, like you said, he's the king of it. Unfortunately, with Otis, memorabilia has been hard to come by. Mm-hmm. I think his family has been working on doing their own museum in Georgia, and then also, of course, he died at the age of 26, which means that, he had fewer things to leave behind. So we're a little lacking in that, unfortunately, but we definitely try to tell the story. I think one of the most important things to understand about Otis is that he really brought black soul music to a white audience like nobody else had ever done before, and he really mainstreamed it, took black soul off the Chitlin circuit and brought it to Europe and California and basically worldwide. And I think that as important as he was as an artist and his output, he was really an ambassador for the type of music that places like Memphis and Muscle Shoals have really become famous for. And I think we try to tell that story.
And for such an important artist in music history and American music history, one of the reasons why I did invite you on, Ezra, is that I think, at least in my opinion, that there seems to be a little bit of a dearth of biographical material on him. Am I crazy for saying that?
I think that's right. One thing, Jonathan Gould recently came out with a great book about Otis Redding, which I'm in the middle of right now. Actually, I unfortunately wasn't able to finish that before the interview, but that one's been excellent. And then I actually, and yesterday, if people want to, there was the New Yorker, I believe the New Yorker and the Atlantic did some kind of 50-year anniversary retrospects that I found fascinating. And even in those short pieces, I was able to learn some stuff I didn't know, but in general, I agree. There is a dearth of information about Otis, and which is unfortunate. But I am, encouraged that we're starting to see a stream of things starting to come out, which hopefully will let people know just how important he was.
Hopefully, I didn't put a little too much pressure on you with that one a little bit. So you're going to be representing Otis today, and I have no doubt that you're going to do a great job. And so let's start with the man himself. I mean, how would his friends and family describe him?
Well, from everything I've heard and from the interviews I've seen with people like the Memphis Horns, Booker T and the MGs, I think it's easy to say he may be the most beloved man at Stax. They all just talk about, before Otis, that the label was doing well, it had some buzz, but they said when Otis walked in that door, it just really changed the dynamics, and everybody spoke about how he was one of those people who, lit up a room, but he was also just apparently great at every facet. He did a lot of his own publishing, his own arrangements, and although he didn't write music, a lot of the musicians talk about how he would walk in there and sing a bass line or sing a horn section to the horn players, and just how amazed they were that just the breadth of his knowledge, his attitude, his spirit, his confidence. So yeah, from everything I've seen or read, it just seems like he was really a beloved figure and really the heart of Stax Records.
What was his early years like growing up in Georgia, and how that later influenced him to become one of the best musicians of all time?
Like a lot of musicians of his era, a lot of the greats, from Aretha Franklin to Ray Charles, he was steeped in the church and was really raised on gospel music, and then started to learn these early soul singers. People like Sam Cooke had a huge influence on him. And one of the things I think is so interesting is when he arrived in Memphis, I think he was maybe only 21 years old. He was actually acting as a valet for a man named Johnny Jenkins. So he was part of the Pine Toppers, which was Johnny Jenkins' group. So he had started to do more secular music, kind of early soul music. But yeah, when he arrived at Stax, he did not arrive as a singer, but rather as a valet. So although he had a musical background, I don't think anybody, including himself, really knew he was primed for superstardom, which I think is one of the greatest parts of the story. He almost stumbled into being perhaps the greatest singer, of all time.
What do you mean by that? Tell us, like when it came to his big break, what were the circumstances that led to that?
Like I said, he was part of the Pine Toppers, which was a regional group, never got huge, but Johnny Jenkins, who's the singer, didn't have a license, and so he came to Stax as a solo artist, left the Pine Toppers back home, but asked Otis, who did have a driver's license, if he would drive. So the story I've heard is Johnny Jenkins showed up and actually kind of failed to really vibe with Booker T and the MGs, who were the house band. He kind of auditioned with them. They said it didn't really work. They just couldn't get on the same page. And then at some point, Otis told him, well, I'm a singer as well. So being the visionaries that they were, and part of so much of the Stax legacy is willing to take chances on unknown artists, they gave him an audition, and at his very first audition, he wrote a song he had written called These Arms of Mine, which of course is a classic now. And apparently, where Johnny Jenkins had failed to, really resonate with the band, they said it was instantaneous that Otis was this guy, and we need to sign him. And so, yeah, they jammed a little bit with Booker T and the MGs, and he really had a special relationship, apparently pretty early on, with Steve Cropper, the great guitarist for the MGs. And yeah, signed the contract, from what I understand, within that week. So what started off as a audition for another performer ended up with Otis having the record contract and Mr. Johnny Jenkins left to go back home.
Yeah, I'm sure Jenkins probably regretted that one a little bit. I mean, Otis Redding, I mean, he was going to make it no matter what, and he could probably vibe with anyone. And it's amazing that you bring up These Arms of Mine. I mean, that's the first single he had. Like you said, it was the first song he cut. I mean, that's an instant classic. How do you record your first song to be an instant classic? And
That's right.
if I'm being a little honest with you, Ezra, I may have shed a couple tears here and there on a certain few days just listen to that song. I mean, that song it evokes so much emotion. And how does someone, I mean, like you mentioned before, he was only 21 at the time. I mean, how does someone at such a young age have sing in such a way that evokes those type of emotions?
Oh, that is a question that I am unable to answer, but I think one of the most fascinating things about him is just because he died at 26, and I'm still young. I'm 31, but I listened to him, and the idea that I'm 5 years older than Otis was when he died is mind-boggling to me. Just because he has so much maturity and emotional depth, and he sounds older than time. Just somebody who'd lived 1,000 lives by the time he was 21, and yeah, to me, I think that's one of the most amazing parts of his legacy. And like I said, he did so much of his own songwriting, so it wasn't just a young man covering old standards in a new way. He's writing, arranging, and singing these songs that, like you said, just go, way beyond his years. So I think that's certainly one of the enduring parts of his legacy.
Yeah, I actually have goosebumps just talking about it and thinking about it, to tell you the truth. And music, this more so than anybody as a tour guide at the museum. I mean, music is genealogical. Genres are like family trees, each musician branching off from another one. And so many huge artists have named him as a big influence. Janis Joplin, Marvin Gaye, Al Green, certain songs from the Beatles, Zeppelin. I mean, they've all said that they were an inspiration, that he was an inspiration. I mean, those are some huge names. But I want to talk about, who influenced him. I mean, who did he grow up listening to?
The person who really defined his career, and I think who he based himself off of, was Sam Cooke. Otis often talked about, how important Sam was to just his trajectory as an artist, and kind of helped bring him outside of that, gospel influence into more secular music. And I also think that Little Richard, just that raw energy, less in the musicality, but Otis is famous for his just barn-burning live performances, and I think a lot of that came from that, just raw, real, the energy and the physicality that people like Little Richard brought. So yeah, it's gospel, Sam Cooke, and Little Richard. From what I've heard and from what I've seen, I think those would probably be the three biggest pillars of his influence.
Didn't Otis also end up working with Little Richard's backing band as well?
If that's true, then that is news to me, which is fascinating. I don't know if I'd heard that, or if I had, I'd forgotten, but I can neither confirm nor deny that one.
Okay, if you will find out and deny it, don't let me know, and then I will edit this. No.
Fair enough. I'll
take this off the file.
But yeah, I hadn't heard that, but it wouldn't surprise me.
When you're giving tours at the museum, is there a favorite story that you like to tell about Otis Redding?
Like I said, I think the fact that he showed up, the one I told a little earlier, showed up as a valet and walked out as a signed artist who had a hit song within months. I think it's something a lot of people don't know that I just find fascinating. And also, it's a bit more tragic, but the story of Sittin On the Dock of the Bay is one I've always... It's heartbreaking, but I've always enjoyed it. As Otis had really a breaking turn at the Monterey Pop Festival and came back to Stax, and I think was influenced by that, being around more folksy musicians, more kind of rock bands, and apparently came back and because his friend Steve Cropper, the guitarist from the MGs, and said, I've been working on new material and I've got this track. And the two sat down, laid out what was to be Sittin On the Dock of the Bay, and they decided that there was a last verse that they wanted to put down, and they also wanted to add the staple singers as backup singers. And so as a placeholder, Otis whistled and said, we'll come back and, fill in these parts where I'm whistling. And then maybe a week later, he tragically died in that plane crash. And so what we're left with is Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, which has the whistling track, which was never intended, but I think makes the song so much richer. So one of those, it's both tragic and also a happy little accident that, once again, I just think that whistling part's so endearing and human and was never meant to be, but I think it's a richer song for it. So that's another story that I really like from the life of Otis.
I want to come back to Dock of the Bay because it's so intertwined with his death that you almost can't talk about one with the other. So I want to save a large segment toward the end of the show toward it. So let's come back to that in a little bit. Let's continue talking about his music because, I mean, really that is what brings us here together. So we talk about how he, his first album, because, an all-time song, These Arms of Mine. I believe it was maybe a year or two later that his next album comes out. Great Otis Redding Sings Soul Ballads. Album has Booker T, has Isaac Hayes, and it actually has his first top 10 single, Mr. Pitiful, which, of course, is his nickname. Tell about his nickname and where that originated from.
The Great Otis Redding Sings Soul Ballads. It's his second album. I believe it came out in '65. And, yeah, it featured Mr. Pitiful. In terms of what I'm trying to, I think that he got the nickname Mr. Pitiful from a disc jockey. Is from what I believe what I've heard, and I do not remember that disc jockey's name, but disc jockey started calling him that just because of that. I don't know if, I guess pitiful is a word, but kind of pleading sound he would have when he was singing ballads. And from what I know, Steve Cropper had the idea based on that nickname to write this song. So he and Otis sat down, and pumped it out. And like I said, they were one of the unheralded duos. You've got, Porter and Hayes, the great songwriters from Stax, but I think Otis and Steve Cropper really, together as a force, have a lot to do with Otis's legacy. He was a force on his own, but I think Steve and him together and Mr. Pitiful being a great example of that, is in addition to Dock of the Bay. But yeah, the two of those guys seem to have a symbiosis together and really came out with some great stuff.
Is Steve Cropper, he's still alive and playing today, right?
That's right. Yeah, Steve's still around. So in addition to the Rock and Soul Museum, we also have a second museum, the Memphis Music Hall of Fame, and thankfully we do a induction ceremony every year, and Mr. Cropper's been to maybe the last 2 or 3, so I've had the pleasure of meeting him, and he's a great guy, still a great guitar player, and full of stories. So yeah, thankfully Steve is still around. Definitely one of the better parts of the job is getting to sit down with some of these guys who were there and helped create the music and just hearing them reminisce. It really is special.
What do they think about the music business then? I mean, how do they talk about it in positive ways outside of obviously making music together? But what about the actual business and industry itself? What was it like for them working in it then?
I think the sense I get, Stax was different, and of course Stax was their, that defined their reality. But largely what you hear is just what a willingness there was to make mistakes, to be loose, to go in the studio and jam until it sounds right, and then we'll hit record. And I think that that's really just that family aspect. Of course, it was one of the very first interracial labels from the top to the bottom. Booker T and MGs were an interracial band. Al Bell was, an owner of Stax along with Jim Stewart and Estelle Axton. So I think it really felt like an oasis, especially in the South, just a safe space where they could get together, be creative, bounce ideas off each other, and the rest would handle itself is kind of what it sounds like. I don't think they worried too much about the financial side or the selling records or the marketing. They just cared about getting together, making the best music they could, and apparently that was enough because, as we know now, they came out with some of the most enduring music of the 60s and 70s.
And Stax, like you said, was unique because they brought together so many different races and cultures. And that was a big philosophy for Otis, particularly with making music.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that spirit of teamwork and collaboration was huge at Stax and really something that Otis embraced. So from everybody, Booker T and MGs to the Memphis Horns, Wayne Jackson and Andrew Love, the great horn duo who also had a special relationship with Otis. It seemed like everybody in the building was on the same page. Well, that is, of course, not completely true, but for the most part, it really did seem like they were all together for this common goal, which was to come out with the best Southern soul music they knew how.
Otis Redding, I believe a couple years into working with Stax, didn't he end up kind of doing a subsidiary record label, Jodis Records? I mean, that was pretty unheralded at the time.
Yeah, that's right. I can't substantiate that. I don't know a lot about it, but I do know that was true and that he was given that creative control, which I think is awesome. And once again, one of the things that defines Stax is a willingness to give creative control over to the artist, to let them make their own decisions. And 9 times out of 10, it seemed like a wise decision. And even down back to, I think it's really the defining characteristic of Memphis music in general, from Sun to Stax to High, was a trust in the process, a willingness to take chances, and a willingness to, once again, give over a bit of that control to your artist and to let them make their own choices, which, yeah, with Otis having that subsidiary, I think is a great example of that.
Now, some of, Otis's best stuff was his cover songs, Try a Little Tenderness, Pain in My Heart, Nobody Knows You When You're Down and Out. The list goes on. And covering songs then, it was pretty common at the time. You could hear the same songs by multiple artists on the same radio station all day long then. Bob Dylan once said that, when Hendrix covered his song All Along the Watchtower, that he even improved the song. Would you say that those type of sentiments, the ones that Dylan had toward Hendrix covering his song, would you say that was kind of the rule or the exception when it came to artists covering other artists and how they felt about it?
That's a good question. What's funny is that Otis is a great example of that. I Try a Little Tenderness. I don't know if the listeners have ever heard earlier versions, but his version is just a completely different reinterpretation. That he owns it now. But what's funny about that is, of course, one of Otis's songs was Respect, which Aretha owned, and he said as much. So there it is right there, as he both was able to cover other people's songs and completely own them and make them his own, but also had the same done to him, which, everything I read, he said, that's Aretha's song. That I didn't know it at the time, but that was written for her. She owned it. And so I think that's pretty cool, the ability to both reinterpret it and also have other people reinterpret your music and to embrace those versions as well. So, yeah, there's countless examples of that in his music. I'm struggling right now. The Rolling Stones cover he did.
Not Satisfaction.
Satisfaction. Yeah. His version of Satisfaction, which I wouldn't say it's hard to improve on the Stones, but yeah, there's several examples of him doing wonderful cover songs, but like I said, also of cover versions of him that he fully embraced.
Sticking with the covers part, on his third album, Otis Blue, he covered 3 Sam Cooke songs, and you said he was a big influence on Otis as well. And Sam Cooke, before that album dropped, he died a few months before that. Do you think that was an ode to Sam Cooke, or that just happened to be more timing than anything?
No, I think that from what I've read and from what I've heard, that it was definitely meant as kind of an homage to his hero. Because like you said, he had just died a few months earlier, before Otis Blue came out. So yeah, I think that was definitely, Otis's way of saying goodbye to one of his heroes and to give him the best tribute he knew how to do, which I think we would both agree was an excellent one.
All right, let's take a quick break right now. More on the life, music, and tragic death of Otis Redding when The Mind's Eye returns. We're back on The Mind's Eye talking about the life of seminal artist Otis Redding. And I'm going to pose a classic situation to you, Ezra. You are stranded on an island. You have one song that you could play, and it has to be an Otis Redding song. What song do you choose?
I should have been prepared for have.
Yeah, you should have.
That is, you know, Try a Little Tenderness just has a place in my heart. I love Coffee and Cigarettes. I think that's one of the lesser known ones that I can always go back to. Man.
Well, I'm glad that you said try a little tenderness, because I heard a story that the publishers, they wanted to stop from him actually recording that song because, quote unquote, it would be, they didn't want it from the Negro perspective. I mean, was that just essentially underlying different tones for racism, or what were they, why would they want to try and stop that song? I mean, it's such a great, unbelievable cover.
I think that's the easiest way to read it. I actually, there was an article, I'm going to look this up. It just came out. Oh, it was one of the one I was just talking about in the Atlantic. And the name of that article was Hearing Otis Redding's Try a Little Tenderness as a Song of Resistance. And they make a really great case about how he took this song that was on its face, a kind of a love song, and really made it, the tenderness not being about towards a particular girl, but towards African Americans in general. And it's definitely an article worth reading, and I think it makes a great point. And so whether or not that's where they were coming from, I can't say, but it certainly, I think, did, maybe it's a stretch to call it a protest song or a civil rights song, but I don't think it's hard to interpret it that way, especially the way he sings it. So that certainly makes sense to me. But yeah, thankfully they lost in the end, and that, he gave us one of the greatest songs of all time, in my opinion.
What was it like for Otis Redding at that time? I mean, he, like you said, he was working with Stax, which was unique because they were bringing all these different cultures. How were they viewed from the other labels, kind of looking in on them, seeing that they were so different and they were being successful? I mean, how were they viewed as at the time?
What made Stax different is you had other great labels, Motown, of course, being the most obvious, that were doing black music, but until Stax, it was always black artists kind of coming out with music that was made in a lot of ways for white audiences. It was palpable, to those. It had mainstream appeal. I think what Stax did was really take music from kind of the chitlin circuit that had really been only for black audiences and refine it maybe a little bit. But what you got from Stax and what you got from Otis was this rawness, this realness, this, energy. And I think a lot of people took note and ended up trying to emulate that. A great story is about Wilson Pickett, who of course is a legend, and had a great career before then, but said Wilson Pickett, once he heard Otis Redding on the radio, and he said, okay, that's what I want to sound like. And he actually came down to Memphis and recorded at Stax. But so I think it had a very real impact on other artists, especially other black artists who, maybe were coming out with music that was great, but a little bit more, like I said, refined, a little bit more polished. And I really do think the Stax sound, and Otis in particular, I've encouraged artists to buy into that rawness and that realness, and, to really speak from the heart and to not be afraid of making mistakes or of a missed note here or there, because it really adds to the charm and adds to the sound.
And I think that's something that today's music industry, for the most part, mainstream-wise at least, of course, is that, being willingness to make mistake. I mean, nowadays everything's so overdubbed in the studio that, and it's also highly, finely tuned that, they don't let the songs breathe a little bit, in my opinion.
That's right. Yeah, so much of the magic comes in those unplanned for moments, whether it's, like I said, a missed note that somehow adds to it, or a crack in the voice, or even Otis's whistling, like I said, which was never intended, but ended up being such an endearing part of that song and pop culture. I think that we're really missing out when we don't embrace that, that organic sound that comes from, what's hopefully the magic that's happening in the studio if you're doing it right.
When I'm being critical of a musician, I always like to see them perform. Like, how does the music translate from the studio to the concert? And before, you briefly mentioned that, he was Otis Redding. He was considered to be one of the best live performers of his generation. I mean, you could probably argue that his performances were key in him making his initial break, and then help him make other decisive turning points in his career. Would you agree?
Yeah, I absolutely would. And I think that was a big, the live shows, more than the singles, more than, I think are really what helped break Otis open. And not just Otis, but, soul music kind of followed behind him. And so there's these legendary tours of Europe, which Otis and the whole roster of musicians who were on those trips talked about as just being transformative. One, because white audiences there were more, I think racism was less of a problem. The white audiences were more willing to listen and just apparently had their minds blown everywhere they went in Europe. On both sides, both the audiences and the musicians, there was this mutual affection that I don't think they necessarily had felt stateside. So they became, heroes in Europe, heroes in England, and then, of course, the Monterey Pop Festival, which was really his huge national coming out. And you said people like Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin and some of the biggest stars of the 60s were on that tour, and all accounts, Otis left as the star, just because of that, his physicality, his raw emotion, his drive, and then, of course, he had one of the greatest backing bands of all time, and both the MGs and later on the Bar-Kays, who traveled with him. But yeah, I think live music really helped solidify his reputation and really helped spread it throughout the nation outside of Memphis and, black music circles.
Just to kind of go off on a little side rant here, one of the things is, because you talked about it, it's one of the things that really pisses me off with American musical history is that, Otis Redding, like you said before, he really became more well-known in Europe before in America, or at least was, even more popular. Same deal with Jimi Hendrix. We have two homegrown seminal artists, and they get recognized in Europe, thousands of miles across the Atlantic, or before that they even get recognized really in America. That's like having to make a comparison, it's like having in sports your own homegrown player, and then, they go off somewhere and kind of get popular somewhere else and sign up, and then they come back years later when they've already made famous. That's just one thing that always really just pissed me off. Like, American music artists, like, our fans, why didn't you see it at the time,
That's right. Excuse me, that's exactly right. And I think a lot of it really does come down to race. Of course, there was, racial resentment in Europe, but I think they were more willing to accept these black artists, and that goes back even further to the, embrace of kind of our roots music. Led Zeppelin, of course, was basically reinterpreting, blues and proto-blues, and so there was just a willingness on the other side of the pond, so to speak, to accept these black artists, to and make them feel welcome. That should certainly be praised, but yeah, we definitely missed out on a lot of that, I think, here in America by not fully embracing our artists early enough. And with somebody like Otis, by not embracing them early enough, you missed out on, of a 5-year career, you're missing out on 3 of them, which is really a tragedy. Of course, we now have that music, but I think that really speaks to what's lost when you're not willing to look in your own backyard as somebody with such a tragically brief. Well, Jimi Hendrix as well, of course, is when your career lasts 5 or 6 years and we're ignoring you for 3 of them, then, you pay for that.
Absolutely. And like you said before, Monterey Pop Festival, that's such a huge moment. And also Whiskey A Go-Go, that was another huge moment for him.
That's right.
That's right. Expansive. Why do you think Redding was so good at connecting with the audience and being such a phenomenal live performer, particularly because at that time there were so many good live performers and he was considered to be one of the best?
I think that he wasn't scared of his physicality. I think that we know this to be true with Elvis, is when he first started to be, to shake his hips, it was scandalous. And for a black man, it was doubly so. And I think a lot of the big black artists at that time were piano players who, were sitting down to their performances or were more crooners. And I really do think in a lot of ways, Otis was the first black male performer to come out there with what can only be called this raw sexuality, just this pleading, passionate. He was a big man. He had a lot of physicality. People have heard him compared, to football players and just his his overwhelming physicality. And I think that really, maybe it's hard to see now, but I really think at the time that was transformative, is to see somebody go out there and not be afraid to be sexual, not be afraid to be raw, not afraid to push his voice to the limits. And I really think that's where Otis kind of kicked the door open. He was the first of what became a long line of great performers like that, but I think Otis was really the first, at least to perform in front of white audiences to such a large degree.
How was Otis Redding, like, his onstage demeanor? Was it similar, or was it just kind of more of an act than anything?
I don't know if I would call it an act, but I think it was a part of his personality that you didn't necessarily see if you know him, because by all means he was a family man.
Right.
I believe at the time of his death he had 3 children. He spent a lot of time at his farm in Georgia. So I think in person he was much more quiet, subtle, thoughtful, caring, but when he was on stage, you really got that other half of his personality. So a bit of it was performative, I'm sure, if not a lot of it. But I also think that he was tapping into something that was real within himself that he didn't necessarily let show in his, daily life. Because there's stories of people who knew Otis saying they saw him for the first time and jaws dropped, because who was it? Or maybe even in the studio. But when he was singing, he was a different man than I think a lot of people knew just from day-to-day interactions.
So it's 1967, Otis Redding, you talk about Monterey, he gives arguably the best performance at the biggest concert of the year, surrounded by the best artists. And then a few months later, he writes his signature song, Dock of the Bay, which is to become his first and only #1 single. I mean, everything was coming together. 1968, he was supposed to be, pretty much the culmination of his career. He was booked for Ed Sullivan's show, New York's Philharmonic Hall. I mean, and, this is kind of where tragedy steps in, because you can't really talk about Dock of the Bay without talking about his death, because, he did record it just 3 days before it, from my understanding.
Yep, that's right. That's right. And I do think that is a big part of the story. Yeah, it wasn't that he was, just in the middle of his prime. It's so sad. And his artistship, of course, was growing, as we hear from Dock of the Bay, which was in a lot of ways radically different from what he had done earlier, picking up on new influences outside of kind of his Southern soul influences. And I think that, thank God we got it. I guess we should be lucky that it was recorded before then, but it does leave you wondering and wanting, and just what a tragedy, because like you said, it was really, we haven't peaked, we're ascending, quickly, and it was all cut short. So who knows? But as wonderful as he was, and I think he would have been a musician like a Stevie Wonder or a Prince, who really was able to, because I said he produced and arranged his own stuff, and I think like those artists who have these long storied careers that are, what's the word I'm looking for? They really defined their own sound, and I think Otis was getting there. I think he was just about to transcend and to really come out with, his own unique thing, and it was cut short, which is just horribly tragic for so many reasons.
Yeah, I think Stevie Wonder's a great comparison. I actually just saw him the other day. He did, I saw him perform Intervisions and Talking Book, and he sounded phenomenal. You wouldn't think that he was, whatever, late 60s or whatever it is. And I couldn't agree more with you. I think Redding is one of music's biggest what ifs. I mean, he really was coming into his own as a songwriter. I can't help to think, what would it be like decades now? This. Bob Dylan and Paul Simon, quietly, they're in their 70s, and they're quietly putting out some of the best work of their careers.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And like you said, what could have been? Because what we got in that brief stint of 5 years is mind-boggling, and it seemed like it was just getting better and better.
Yeah, I think that same 3-week session, he also wrote Dreams. I Got Dreams to Remember. That's another all-time song.
That is another all-time song.
Clicking it, that's right. Song after song, he just clicks off, classic, 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 every single album. It's impressive, and it's I don't even know. It's staying with Dock of the Bay. It's funny. I read a few stories that for a label like we said before, Stax was so unique for trying different things. I heard a bunch of people at the label didn't even really like the song, or they were, I guess, maybe afraid of the song because it was so different.
Right, and that's where they get credit. And I like to think that had he not died, it still would have been released, because there's several stories from Otis to other artists of Stax initially. Albert King being a great example. Albert King says there's a lot of skepticism, but they say let's go for it, and you end up with something like Born Under a Bad Sign, which one of the greatest blues albums of all time. So Stax certainly gets credit for taking those chances, putting the trust in the artist, even if they didn't quite get it, which, again, the two label owners were middle-aged white folks who would often admit, we didn't know what, we were not the best judges of this music, but we trusted our artist, we trusted the musicians, other musicians' feedback, and so you end up with some different but wonderful things like Dock of the Bay.
The lyrics, they could be subjectively taken as a bit dark. Do you take it that way?
I don't. I understand that impulse. I think of it as more contemplative, is how it seems to me, and it actually brings me a little solace that, and I hope I'm right, that he was at a place of, kind of introspection and feeling a bit of his own solace before his life was taken. But I certainly understand. It's just hard. It's hard with a song like that is so tied to his death to really look at it objectively, and to not, put our own readings into it. But personally, that's how I look at it, as a song of introspection, a song of quietude. But
and I think he was. I think he was recovering from throat surgery at the time when he was writing the lyrics. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, he had throat surgery not long before, and of course there were fears about how it would affect his, his voice and his career. But by all accounts, and even based on what Otis said himself, his voice came back richer and stronger than ever.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is kind of the part where we can't really avoid it. 'Cause he was such an amazing life. You do have to commemorate, particularly when it comes to these tragic deaths. And this is the 50th year of his of the death. And I guess let's talk about that. December 10th, 1967. Tell about the circumstances and the events that led up to it.
Otis, whose backing band at the time was the Bar-Kays, a group of mainly high school kids, or right after high school kids, and they were leaving a show, I believe, in Cleveland, headed to Madison, Wisconsin. Like Vicky said, it was right around now, so just a couple weeks before Christmas. And so all of the Bar-Kays, except for one member, James Alexander, who stayed back, and then the Memphis Horns actually stayed back as well. The rest of them, though, were on their way to Madison, Wisconsin, caught in a bad storm, lost, apparently had electrical problems with the airplane, and plane crashed and killed everyone except for Ben Colley. So not only did Stax, and not just Stax, did the world lose one of the best singers and one of the most beloved singers, but also, and I think it's part of the story that we overlook a bit, is just those really young, wonderful musicians, the Bar-Kays, who perished as well, all but, like I said, Ben Colley. So it was really, and this was just a hard time for the country in general, with the political climate, the racial climate, and then I think that the death of Otis really was just devastating for Memphis, for Stax, and for the nation at large. Just such an unexpected death from such a promising and popular young artist.
Ben Colley, the only survivor, does he remember anything at all about the accident?
Ben actually died in 2015, but I did have the chance to meet him, and his telling of it is really one of the more heartbreaking parts of it all. Is Ben says he couldn't swim, and so when the plane crashed, they're in the water, and his band members knew he couldn't swim, reached him, pulled him out, put him on top of like a a seat cushion, I believe, so that he could float. And then he said after that he lost sight of him and just could hear screams and total silence and was left floating alone. So his band members, from his telling, actually may have sacrificed their own lives in order to save him, knowing he couldn't swim. So once again, hearing his telling of it is really brings home the tragedy of it all, and just, you know, how awful that scene must have been.
And I think it was Redding's plane that they were using at the time, right? The two.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct.
Just terrible. Just and like you said, that devastated the country, and you know, pretty much after that, Stax was done.
Yeah, it was done
combined with some bad
as
business
it
moves.
existed at that time. It had a bit of a rebirth, which with Isaac Hayes kind of being the new star, and it did a little bit more of a kind of a funk thing. But yeah, the Soulsville of the '60s and that spirit of unity, and I think really kind of died along with Otis. And once again, there were some great years after, but in terms of the heyday of Stax, it really ended with Otis Redding.
But you know, I want to end on a more uplifting note. And Otis, he was considered to be, I mean, he was one of the most well-respected artists of his day. I mean, and not just artists, but people. I mean, he won the 1966 NAACP Lifetime Membership Award. I mean, that's a pretty big award for someone under 20, you know, under 27.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then I was reading not too long ago that, and I wish I should have written it down, that he won the award for, and I don't know who's giving out the award, but won the award for Best Male Vocalist for the first time in a decade, where Elvis had won it every year for a decade, and then Otis finally took the crown, so to speak. So that right there, he was the man who could, you know, taking the singing crown from Elvis says it all.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty big. I think in 1 year he actually outsold. I think I was reading the same article that he outsold Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin combined in the same year. I mean, when you take off Elvis Presley and you take off Frank Sinatra, I think you're doing something right there at the time.
I would say so. It's hard to beat that, isn't it?
and Otis was really big into philanthropic work, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, from everything I've read, he was a very giving man. Always put his money towards helping others, and then also on a personal level, like I said, seemed so beloved, and people who knew him personally would always speak about just one of those people. If you're down, he'll make you feel better. If he can help you run an errand, he would be there for it. So both philanthropic and also just on a personal level, one of those really special, beloved people.
I don't think there's a better place to end it off right there. Ezra, I have a feeling you might be getting a few special requests after this interview. Can people do that with the Memphis Rock and Soul Museum? Can they walk in and say, I want Ezra Wheeler and no one else to give me a tour guide? To give me a tour.
You have no idea how much of a kick my bosses would get if that ever happened. So by all means, if you want to request me by name, then I would be happy to come down. But yeah, absolutely. If you ever, or any of your listeners are ever in Memphis, we'd love to have you. Like I said, Rock and Soul is an excellent one. We also have the Memphis Music Hall of Fame, which focuses more on the individuals rather than that story. So yeah, please make it down to Memphis. It's a great town, and come see us.
And before I let you go, throw out some of the museum's social media information in case people want to connect a little bit earlier before visiting.
You can visit us at our website at Memphis Rock, the letter N, soul.org. You can also find us on Facebook, and we have an Instagram account as well, which is Rock and Soul Museum. So yeah, follow us there, or feel free to visit our website. It should have all the updated information. We're actually doing some major renovations for the first time in maybe a decade plus. We decided the time has come. The story largely ends, like I said, with the civil rights era, the end of Stax, and we decided that it was time to really talk about the influence that this music's had on the world. And so we're going to be working on a final exhibit that has interviews with artists around the world, from different genres, just talking about how the music of Memphis influenced them, their careers, how soul music helped lead to hip hop, on and on. So it's going to be really trying to add an exploration that wraps it up, that really contextualizes, Memphis's role in music history. So that should be awesome, and that should be done by spring of 2018, I want to say. So if you've been before but haven't been in a long time, come see us next year, and hopefully it'll be a whole new experience.
I'm going to book my ticket right now, my friend.
Absolutely. Well, can't wait to see you.
And I maybe if no one goes in there and demands you, I will be the first one. I will definitely do that. You'll know when I get there, to say the least.
Yes, sir. Well, I'm happy to do it.
This has been Ezra Wheeler, tour guide at the Memphis Rock and Soul Museum. Thank you so much for paying homage to one of the greats tonight. Expect me to know you again for another music session.
Anytime. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much.
The Mind's Eye Coda when we come back. 1, 2, 3, 4, get ready for the encore. Oh, I had to subject you to one last time of my awful voice before send you off for the holidays and the New Year's. And now that the wrapping of the episode has been torn off, you used the gift at least a little bit. Hopefully you used the whole gift tonight. Was it as good as you hoped for? Even better? Aw, you're so nice. You're the best. But in all seriousness, this is the time of year where we do focus on the things that we are grateful for, we are thankful for. So to put the way I feel about you, the listener, doesn't truly justify my emotions for how grateful and thankful I am to you. For the listener, the subscriber, the person who takes time out of their very busy schedule to listen to the Mind's Eye and this little podcast we got going on here. Particularly thank you for all the YouTube subscribers. It truly is humbling to see the growth of the show reflected in the growth of the subscribers. Thank you so much for listening and spreading the word about the Mind's Eye. We hope to keep justifying that in the future after we come back from the holiday break, after we come back on the other side of 2017. Cannot wait for next year, 2018. Remember to go to our website. We're going to be updating it with future guests once we get the schedule going on after the break. If you haven't been there yet, go there now because we got great stuff. Again, we got the guests, news, blog entries. Let me just say, Captain America, Martin Luther King, nothing to do with each other except for the Mind's Eye blog. Go there now, themindseyemedia.com. Again, themindseyemedia.com. Thank you so much. Humbly yours, DJ BJ Turn Off, for the Mind's Eye on Z Talk Radio.